The date hit me before the disappearance did. Not the letter itself. Not the measurements it contained, or the floor plan sketch folded inside it, or the careful field notes describing deliberate drainage channels cut into a stone floor at 23 feet depth in the Ohio River Valley. Those details came later. What stopped me first was the precision of the date. October 22, 1879. Not October of 1879. Not the autumn of 1879. October 22, a specific day, a specific document, a specific entry in the Bureau of Ethnology's incoming correspondence log that sits in the Smithsonian Institution archives today, catalogued and accessible, in a bound volume that researchers can request and examine. The entry is there. The letter it records is not. I have held the correspondence log. I have turned to the October 1879 section and found the entry exactly where the finding aid said it would be, a single line in a neat institutional hand, recording the receipt of a communication from a field researcher named T.H. Mercer, describing a structural discovery in the Ohio River Valley, noting the enclosure of measurements and a sketch. The entries before it are in the file. The entries after it are in the file. The correspondence from October 22, the letter, the measurements, the sketch, is not in the file. The gap is the exact width of a folded letter and its enclosures. The space where a document was and is no longer. And in the 145 years since that entry was made, no published record has acknowledged the gap, no institutional explanation has been offered for it, and T.H. Mercer has not appeared in any subsequent Bureau of Ethnology document that I have been able to locate. A letter arrived. It was logged. It was never seen again. And the discovery it described was never investigated. I found this while researching something else entirely. I was tracing the institutional history of the Bureau of Ethnology, not its published output, which is extensive and well documented, but its unpublished reception record. The Bureau was established in 1879 under the direction of John Wesley Powell, the geologist and explorer who had famously led the first scientific expedition through the Grand Canyon. Its mandate was the systematic documentation of the indigenous cultures, languages, and histories of North America, a mandate it pursued with considerable thoroughness, producing annual reports that are among the most comprehensive ethnological records of the late 19th century. I was looking for the gap between what the Bureau received and what it published. Any active research institution receives more than it publishes. Field researchers send reports that don't make it into the annual series. Preliminary findings get superseded by more complete investigations. Not every incoming communication produces a published outcome. I was looking at the correspondence logs as a way of understanding what the Bureau's field researchers were encountering in the 1870s and 1880s that did not appear in the formal publications. The logs are meticulous. The Bureau's administrative record keeping was thorough. Every incoming communication was logged, dated, and filed. The files are organized by date. They are, with occasional gaps, substantially intact. The gap around October 22, 1879 is not occasional. It is specific. It is the gap around a letter from a field researcher who described a multi-room stone structure with engineered drainage channels at 23 feet depth, submitted measurements and a floor plan sketch, and then, in the institutional record, ceased to exist. What T.H. Mercer found, and what the Bureau of Ethnology decided to do about it, is visible only in the shape of what was removed. The official story goes like this. The Bureau of Ethnology under John Wesley Powell was one of the most productive and methodologically rigorous research institutions in 19th-century American science. Its annual reports documented the cultures, languages, material remains, and histories of indigenous North American peoples with a comprehensiveness that has not been matched before or since. Powell's leadership emphasized systematic fieldwork, careful documentation, and the publication of findings in a form accessible to both professional scholars and the educated public. The Bureau received field reports from researchers across North America. Most were followed up. Many produced published findings. The annual series represents the sustained output of an institution that took its documentary mission seriously. Not every incoming communication produced a published outcome. Field researchers sometimes reported findings that subsequent investigation showed to be misidentified, exaggerated, or inconsistent with the physical evidence on the ground. The Bureau's professional standards required verification before publication. A single field report, even a detailed one, was a starting point rather than a conclusion. The absence of a published Bureau report on T.H. Mercer's discovery does not necessarily indicate institutional suppression. It may simply reflect the normal process of professional verification in which a preliminary field report was assessed and found to require more investigation before it could support publication. Let me be fair to this explanation. It is reasonable. Research institutions do receive reports that are not followed up, for reasons ranging from resource constraints to professional disagreement to simple administrative failure. The Bureau of Ethnology was not immune to the institutional limitations of any large organization operating in the 19th century. A single missing follow-up is not, in isolation, evidence of suppression. But here is what the official framework does not explain. It does not explain why the letter itself is missing from the file. The Bureau's correspondence system preserved field reports whether or not they were followed up. The files contain preliminary reports that were never published. They contain letters describing discoveries that were subsequently investigated and found to be misidentified. They contain communications that led nowhere professionally. The correspondence system preserved them all, because the correspondence system's function was documentation, not editorial selection. The Mercer letter is not in the file. Not because it was not followed up. Because it is not there. The log says it arrived. The file says it did not stay. Those two facts, taken together, describe something more specific than institutional failure to follow up on a preliminary field report. That is not the absence of investigation. That is the absence of the document that would have prompted investigation. The timeline isn't subtle. Let's start with what the log entry tells us about what the letter contained, because the log entry is the only surviving description of what was removed. The Bureau of Ethnology's incoming correspondence log for October 1879 is a bound volume of administrative entries, each recording the receipt of a specific communication. The entries are brief, they record the sender, the date of receipt, the general subject, and in some cases a note about enclosures or follow-up actions. They are not summaries of the documents they record. They are administrative receipts. The entry for October 22 records, Mercer, Th., Ohio Valley Field Report, Structural Discovery, Measurements and Sketch enclosed. 4 elements. A sender. A location. A subject classification. A note about enclosures. Each element tells us something about what the letter contained. The subject classification is structural discovery. In the Bureau's filing taxonomy, structural discovery meant the identification of man-made constructions, buildings, earthworks, walls, floors, in a field context. It was a specific classification, distinct from artifact discovery, from site survey, from cultural documentation. Th. Mercer found a structure. The Bureau's log classified it as such. The measurements. The sketch. Those two enclosures are the elements that stop me every time I read the entry. Field reports to the Bureau of Ethnology did not routinely include measurements and sketches unless the researcher had reason to believe the discovery warranted precise documentation. Casual or preliminary observations were described in prose. Measurements and sketches were the documentation protocol for significant, potentially publishable findings, the material a researcher prepared when he wanted the institution to take what he had found seriously. Th. Mercer prepared measurements and a sketch. He believed the discovery was significant enough to document precisely. He sent the documentation to the Bureau. The Bureau logged receipt. And then the documentation, the letter, the measurements, the sketch, the precise record of what Mercer found at 23 feet depth in the Ohio River Valley on some day before October 22, 1879, was gone from the file before any subsequent researcher could examine it. Speaking of what was at 23 feet depth, there are parallel records that allow us to partially reconstruct what Mercer might have been describing, because similar discoveries in the same geographic region and the same historical period were documented by other researchers who sent reports to other institutions and whose reports are still where they should be. The Ohio River Valley in the 1870s and 1880s was one of the most actively excavated archaeological regions in North America. The mound builder controversy, the debate over who had constructed the earthwork mounds that dotted the landscape of the Ohio and Mississippi valleys, was the dominant question in American archaeology, and the Bureau of Ethnology had been established partly to investigate it. Researchers across the region were excavating, documenting, and reporting. The published record from this period is extensive. Within that published record, there are individual findings that the publication process treated differently from the mainstream documentation. Discoveries of stone structures, not earthworks, but constructed buildings, walls, foundations, at depths greater than 10 feet were reported in the region with a frequency that the mainstream archaeological narrative of the period did not accommodate comfortably. The mound builder framework explained earthworks. It did not explain stone buildings at depths that required a different kind of explanation. Some of those reports were published, briefly, in regional journals before the mainstream professional consensus moved away from them. Some were submitted to institutions and not followed up. And some, like the Mercer communication, arrived at the Bureau of Ethnology, were logged, and did not remain in the files. Which brings me to the specific physical characteristics that the log entry, and the parallel regional record, allows me to partially reconstruct about what Mercer was describing. 23 feet depth. In the Ohio River Valley's lowland terrain, 23 feet of deposit above a standing structure is not consistent with gradual accumulation over the known period of human occupation in the region. It is consistent with rapid burial, the kind of rapid burial that preserves structures rather than allowing them to deteriorate before they are covered. It is consistent with the physical signature of the continental sediment deposit that geotechnical engineers have been noting in boring logs across 19 states for 200 years. The same deposit. The same depth range. The same word, uniform, that appears in every engineering log that encounters it. The drainage channels cut into the stone floor are the detail that I find most significant. Deliberate drainage channels represent a specific level of engineering knowledge, the understanding of water flow, the ability to calculate angles of descent, the technical capacity to cut precise channels into stone at consistent gradient. This is not the engineering of a simple subsistence culture. This is the engineering of a culture that had developed and transmitted specific hydraulic knowledge across generations. A culture capable of this engineering left physical evidence of its capacity in the floor of the room it built. That floor was at 23 feet depth in the Ohio River Valley. T.H. Mercer measured it. He sketched it. He sent the measurements and the sketch to the Smithsonian Institution's Bureau of Ethnology. The Bureau logged the receipt on October 22, 1879. And then the floor, the measurements, the sketch, and T.H. Mercer himself disappeared from the accessible institutional record. The part that keeps me up at night is the specific institutional context in which the letter disappeared. The Bureau of Ethnology in 1879 was not a passive repository. It was an active research institution with a clear scientific mandate, substantial federal funding, and a director, John Wesley Powell, whose scientific reputation rested on his commitment to rigorous documentation and publication. Powell had led the Geological Survey of the Colorado River. He understood what anomalous evidence looked like. He had built an institution whose explicit purpose was to document exactly the kind of pre-contact cultural remains that T.H. Mercer was describing. If the Mercer letter arrived at the Bureau and described what the log entry suggests it described, a multi-room stone structure with engineered drainage channels at 23 feet depth, documented with measurements and a sketch, it would have been exactly the kind of finding that Powell's institution existed to investigate. It would have been, by the Bureau's own mandate and professional standards, a high-priority field report deserving immediate follow-up. No follow-up appears in any Bureau record. No expedition was dispatched to the Ohio River Valley in the months following October 1879 to investigate the Mercer site. No published report appeared in the Bureau's annual series for 1879, 1880, or 1881 describing a stone structure with drainage channels in the Ohio Valley. And T.H. Mercer, who had apparently been conducting field research for the Bureau, or at least reporting to it, in October of 1879, does not appear in any subsequent Bureau correspondence, publication, or administrative record. A field researcher sent a significant report. The institution that received it was built to investigate exactly what it described. The institution did not investigate. The researcher did not send a follow-up. The letter is not in the file. That convergence, of a significant discovery, an institution mandated to investigate it, a non-investigation, and a missing document, is not the convergence of ordinary institutional failure. It is the convergence of a specific response to a specific category of evidence. Which brings me to the pattern that the Mercer case fits into, because the Mercer case is not unique. It is one instance of a pattern that appears across the 19th century institutional record with a consistency that ordinary archival attrition cannot explain. In September of 1853, the Hamilton County Engineer's Office in Cincinnati filed a survey report describing dressed stone at 18 feet depth, stone not locally quarried, in a standing rather than collapsed configuration, composition inconsistent with the local geology. The report recommended further investigation. No further investigation appears in the Hamilton County records. The report itself is in the archive, catalogued and accessible, an anomalous entry between two routine foundation surveys, read by almost no one. In April of 1876, the Fairmount Park Commission in Philadelphia received an engineering report describing pre-colonial basement structures at 16 to 22 feet depth in Fairmount Park. The commission noted receipt. The original report is not in the Fairmount Park Commission archives, the Philadelphia City Archives, or the collections of the Historical Society of Pennsylvania. In March of 1820, the Congressional Survey Commission on New Madrid earthquake damage submitted an appendix containing testimony about landscape alteration beyond ordinary earthquake damage to the federal government. The appendix is referenced in the Commission's own correspondence and index. It is not in any publicly searchable National Archives catalog. And on October 22, 1879, T.H. Mercer's letter arrived at the Smithsonian. The log recorded its receipt. The file does not contain it. For documents. For institutional receipts. For absences. All from the same geographic region. All describing structural anomalies or landscape alterations at depths and scales inconsistent with the mainstream archaeological and geological narrative of the period. All processed by institutions that had the mandate and the resources to investigate. None of them investigated. None of the documents in the accessible public record. The pattern is the finding. The pattern is what no individual missing document, considered alone, can show. Maybe T.H. Mercer's letter was lost in a filing error shortly after it was received, placed in the wrong folder, separated from its log entry, and sitting in an uncatalogued section of the archive that has never been properly sorted. Maybe the Bureau's non-investigation of the Mercer discovery reflects a professional assessment that the field report required in-person verification before institutional resources could be committed, and a planned follow-up expedition that was simply never funded in the subsequent budget cycles. Maybe Mercer himself relocated, changed his field focus, or stopped communicating with the Bureau for personal reasons that had nothing to do with the significance of his discovery. Maybe. 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 But the letter is not where the log says it should be. The Bureau that received it was built to investigate exactly what it described. The researcher who sent it disappeared from the institutional record at the same moment his discovery did. And 3 other institutional records from the same geographic region and historical window show the same pattern of receipt, acknowledgement, and subsequent absence. The gap in the file is not the width of a filing error. It is the width of a decision. The Smithsonian Institution archives are in Washington, D.C. They are a serious scholarly archive with professional staff and publicly accessible finding aids. The Bureau of Ethnology correspondence logs from 1879 are in them, available to any researcher who makes an appointment and requests the relevant boxes. I have made that appointment. I have requested those boxes. I have held the log and read the entry for October 22, 1879. The entry is exactly where the finding aid says it is, in the neat institutional hand of a clerk who took his documentation responsibility seriously enough to record the receipt of a field report from a researcher most subsequent scholars have never heard of, describing a discovery at 23 feet depth that most subsequent scholars have never read about. The entry is in the log. The letter it records is not in the file. The site T.H. Mercer described, located in the Ohio River Valley at coordinates he included in his communication, coordinates that survive in the log entry even though the letter does not, is now under a road built in 1923. The stone floor is still there, at 23 feet depth, below the road surface, below whatever fill was added when the road was built, below 2 centuries of deposit that has been accumulating above it since it was sealed in whatever event covered it before Mercer found it and measured it and sketched it and sent the documentation to an institution that logged its receipt and lost the document. The drainage channels are still cut into the stone. The floor is still level. The room is still there at 23 feet depth, sealed and preserved by the rapid burial that put it there, patient in the way that things are patient when they have been waiting for 145 years for someone to go back to the file and ask what happened to the letter. I don't have answers. Only patterns. Only a log entry from October 22, 1879, in a bound volume in the Smithsonian Institution archives, describing a letter that arrived and did not stay, and a stone floor with drainage channels at 23 feet depth under an Ohio road that has been waiting, since 1923, for someone to ask the right question about the wrong depth. The entry is in the log. The letter is in the gap. And once you understand what that gap contains, what was measured, what was sketched, what was sent to an institution built to care about exactly this kind of discovery and filed with a clerk who recorded its arrival on a specific October day in 1879, you will never read a correspondence log the same way again.